Welcome all. We're here for yet another webinar covering a lot of the stuff that everybody needs to know. Obviously, as far as DC's legislation and the landscape that we're working our way through, better part of the year has all been about the commanders and the rental act. Now, we're going to focus on everything that our landlords need to know, the real estate agents that are working with them, and our clients. Ultimately, as a longtime property manager and realtor, I feel it's my obligation to keep track of these things. And there's no better way to do that than having Sean Hilgendorf joining us. Now, as far as my property management, I have been in the industry for a very long time. I started joining the public policy committee that DCAR holds well before the Office of the Tenant Advocate put in their Bill of Rights. And I thought that that was very directed towards tenants, and landlords don't get a lot of oversight on that. So it was really critical to be able to keep pace with all of the legislation that's coming down the pipeline and be able to enact things as they are developing. And there's opportunities to be able to field that and mold it. Now, Sean's relatively new to the the District Association of Realtors as our Government Affairs Director, but at the same time, he's new to the Wilson Building. Sean, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history and the shifts that you've been able to make over the years?
Thank you, Conrad, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. There's no more important time than right now to be having a conversation about public policy in the district. So, Conrad, as you mentioned, I've been with the Realtors now for just about 9 months, since February. But before that, I was working on the council for the last 11 years. And at the council, I had every legislative role you can have, from intern all the way to ledge director and committee director. I started my career working for David Catania. Then I worked with Kenyon McDuffie and ended my career for the last 6 years at the council, working for Robert White, covering the entire range of public policy, education, public safety, procurement, government ops, and most recently housing. And so through that, I've gotten a pretty deep understanding of how the council operates and built some partners in advocacy that have been really helpful, I hope, for the realtors since I joined this year.
And it's a great opportunity for us to have, because I've done the statistics. We all know the activity within the district, the volume that we're producing. I mean, I think with all the realtors that we represent, all of the transactions that are conducted, it has a huge impact on the overall economy in the city. And of course, of late with the government shutdown, there's obviously conversations about the market conditions. But there's still legislation coming down this pipeline, and it continues to shift. It evolves, right? Now, much of the proposed legislation we're going to be getting into is definitely favoring tenant protections. We're going to talk about a handful of things, specifically with utilities and evictions and rent control. But we also want to talk about a couple of wins that we had this past year that you were primary responsible for orchestrating, along with the rest of our public policy committee chair and a bunch of others that are critically important to those testimonies. And from my perspective, it's critical that our team at EJF Rentals understands how this legislation can impact our clients. And so we're always staying one step ahead of the curve, because we have this capacity and these relationships, especially with the DC Association of Realtors and the DC chapter of National Property Managers. And then, of course, all the other stakeholders that are involved and influence these outcomes, so that we're ultimately protecting all of our clients' best interests. Now, I wanted to take a little step back, and this is something that you can probably go through without any issues, is just giving everybody a brief overview of what the life cycle of a bill looks like, and those opportunities that we have to have an influence on this.
Sure. Thanks, Conrad. So listen, the council, for its size, passes an enormous amount of legislation. And procedure at the council from the outside can look a little complicated. But what I'm going to try to do is walk through how a normal permanent bill goes through this process, and where in that process there's the opportunity for members of our industry to step up and have their voices heard. So when you want to pass a piece of permanent legislation, the first step is for a council member to introduce the bill. The chairman will introduce bills on behalf of the mayor, or another council member will introduce their own legislation. That's really the start of the process. At that stage, Chairman Mendelson will refer that bill to one or more of the council's standing committees. As I mentioned earlier, along the way, I worked for about five of those committees. And then the committee has the bill before them and they have to make a decision. Do they want to move that bill forward or do they want to hold it? This is actually the stage in the process where DCAR, for our part, really gets started with our advocacy, often sending letters trying to influence that decision. If a committee is interested in moving a bill forward, the next step that they have to do for a permanent bill is hold a public hearing. Anybody can join a public hearing. You can either testify in person down at the Wilson Building, where I was just with two of our members earlier today. You can testify on Zoom, or while the record is open, you can submit written comments online at dccouncil.gov. And so, there's a lot of opportunities during that hearing stage for public engagement. We're often working with our members to make sure their voices are heard at the hearing. So then you have the hearing record and the committee staff are poring over it. And I promise you, if you are at a hearing where there's 100 witnesses, you may not think that it matters, but that testimony matters and the staff does read it over and it does influence the council members' decisions on the dais. Once you have that hearing, the next step is if they want to move it forward, the committee will move the bill to what's called a markup. The markup is really the committee vote on the bill, and it reflects any changes that the chair of that committee wants to put forward, right? So it doesn't have to look like the bill is introduced. In fact, you could rewrite the entire bill if you wanted to, but that's what's going to go before the committee for a vote. The committee passes it, then it goes to the full council. The council generally meets twice a month on Tuesdays, every other Tuesday. For a permanent bill to pass, it has to pass the council twice at two meetings that are separated by at least 2 weeks. The goal of that is simply to slow things down so they have to keep getting feedback before a bill actually goes into effect. And so it'll have to pass the council twice after passing the committee. If it does pass, then it goes to the mayor, and the mayor has a couple of options there. The mayor, when she gets a bill that's passed the council, can choose to sign it. She can choose to not sign it, but let it go into effect, or she can choose to veto it. If it vetoes it, it goes back to the council and has to pass again with a supermajority. Once the mayor is done, though, because the district is not yet a state, there's an additional step in this process, which has become more important recently given national politics, and that's that the legislation has to go to Congress for a period of passive review. Congress has, depending on the type of bill, between 30 and 60 days to take action to block it. Otherwise, it goes into effect. It's important in that congressional review period to note Congress doesn't use normal human days to decide how long that they're going to review legislation. It's days that Congress is in session, and so it can actually be a little bit complicated there. But once the bill gets through congressional review, assuming they don't block it, that bill goes into effect. If it has a cost, the effective date of the bill is going to be once it's funded in the budget. Otherwise, it'll go into effect immediately after that.
Fantastic. And I mean, I'm doing this full time, and I know that you are painstakingly involved and down at the Wilson building regularly. And so staying informed and staying engaged and getting that feedback and being able to share those concerns, being able to track the amendments, and then of course getting the word out, because one of the criticisms I always hear is I don't know, right? And ignorance is not going to be bliss or an easy excuse for a lot of this stuff. And so being able to have that actual implications and then being able to put it into action is critical for many. And if you're not keeping pace on this, it's hard to keep track of everything that they're going to be coming down the chute. So after enactment, we got to make sure that we're getting that awareness out, not only to our team, but the public. And I think that there is always going to be criticism about how the district shares that information. So it's important to have these relationships that we have here. Now, one thing that I know that we also have a carryover year, right, this year. So things don't necessarily die at year end. So that all of the stuff that we're going to be getting into in a little bit about future legislation, this will potentially have some impacts going into 2016. But I want to give you accolades and applause for the actions that we've been able to get going this past year, specifically under the Rental Act. Huge reform. And while I will have an upcoming webinar with an attorney that's going to talk about the practical implications, tell us very briefly just about the TOPA reform and the eviction reform that is probably monumental for and landmark victories for us this past year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Conrad. And, there's a piece of this that really came from DCAR's efforts, from your efforts as a member of our public policy committee, and from advocacy down at the Wilson building. Legislation like this doesn't happen by itself. It happens because we keep pushing the needle, and we get to these kinds of outcomes with our partners like the mayor and the majority of the council who voted in favor. So on TOPA reform, three monumental changes. One, for our smallest housing providers who own in buildings with fewer than 4 units that aren't owned by a business corporation, they're now going to be exempt from TOPA. That's going to be huge when they're trying to make transactions and buy and sell those properties. For our new buildings that were built within the last 15 years or 15 years after their certificate of occupancy, they're going to be exempt as well. That's a big deal for investors. And TOPA is simplified in a number of ways. This is a giant omnibus bill, but the purpose of the bill was to reduce the burdens that TOPA is causing in our real estate market, and to exempt these properties like very small housing providers and new housing in the district to supercharge housing production and help us maintain the housing we already have. That's not all, though. In this bill, there's also significant eviction reform, and we were heard on this issue too. For public safety issues, when your tenants are causing public safety issues, the Rental Act will allow those evictions to be accelerated. The Rental Act will now allow you to get protective orders early on in your eviction cases so that the tenant doesn't stop paying rent. They have to pay it into a court registry so that you don't lose out on rent during an eviction case. And even for everyday evictions for non-payment of rent, there's a number of provisions here to accelerate the eviction process by reducing the timeline before filing due to non-payment to 10 days, reducing timelines for summons to be served before an initial hearing to 14 days. And the sum total of all of those changes are going to make it easier to enforce leases, going to make it easier to deal with troublesome tenants, going to make it easier to transact in the district. And things like this would never have happened without our partnerships and advocacy from organizations like this.
100%. So in theory, of course, we're not just reacting, we're influencing, we're advocating. And of course, we're looking at what this impact is on the bottom line and the operational burden that owners have. So talking about the operation side of it, this is going to be our next webinar with Brian Doran off at Kerman. He has joined us previously, and he's going to be able to talk about the practical breakdown of what that eviction laws are going to look like, and the way that things are working through the courts now, as well as touch on a few other legislative matters that had passed this past quarter. Please take a peek at this and sign up now, but I've also put the note in chat. And there will be a Q&A section at the end, so please use the Q&A section for anything that you want us to revisit at the tail end. So here's what's coming down the pipeline. We broke this into 3 different parts. There's a couple of things about utilities. This is a lot about DC water. A couple of things about utilities being cut off. We're going to talk about some of the eviction language, and then of course we're going to talk about rent control. And so this one's probably relatively easy and straightforward. So what are the big takeaways from these different bills that they have put through related to utilities?
Sure. Thank you, Conrad. What's clear when you're looking at the large amount, and I'm going to go over 5 separate bills very briefly here, of utilities legislation coming down, is that the council and each individual council member is reacting to inflation and utility costs that are also impacting housing providers as well as tenants, and concerns about delinquencies and utility payments. That's really what's the driving factor here. And so the outcome is that we see 5 different bills which are absolutely going to impact our industry when likely at least some of these bills or some version of these move through the process. The first one is a bill from Council Member Parker and improving tenant access to water bills. That legislation would allow tenants to receive the water bills that their owners are receiving, allow the tenant to pay a portion of those bills and get a rent credit for that payment. The second one here is on lead-free. We've known now for years that lead in water has been a key issue motivating the council here and cities across the country. This legislation, when there were actually 2 versions of this bill, one by Pinto and one by Louis George, but collectively what they would do is set deadlines for replacing all lead water service lines in public and private properties, prohibit partial lead service line replacements, require enrollment in the district lead service line replacement program, or require housing providers who don't enroll to replace lead service lines themselves. And so there's a big bunch of legislation coming down around those lead service lines between a couple of bills here that could be very impactful. The next bill is the Utility Disconnection Protection Act. This one is specifically regarding electric or gas services, and this is a bill from Nadeau that suggests prohibiting the disconnection of electric or gas services during either the summer or the winter for many residents, specifically district households with children, seniors, people with disabilities, people who are pregnant, and people who receive any public assistance. And it would ban utility disconnection between May 15th and September 15th, and also from November 1st through February 29th for both electric and gas utilities. And so that has the potential to have a large impact on what utilities are coming into the building. The fourth bill here, Fair Housing Practices. This responds to the increase in uses of common area utilities fees that the council was concerned about. So Councilmember Allen introduced this bill that would prohibit housing providers from separately charging tenants for utility charges associated with their common areas. And in addition, it would also require housing providers to let tenants know of any unpaid amounts that are owed within 45 days after they vacate a rental unit. And the final bill here, before we go on to the next two sections, is around DC water billing and disconnection modernization. Again, we're getting into that water billing piece. It would prohibit disconnection during extreme heat or cold. It would require that DC water have a waiting period following a delinquency before they move to disconnection. It would allow receivership proceedings when a housing provider is delinquent on their water bills. And I think one of the impactful things that Alan is proposing here that we've had a lot of discussion about in the PPC is it would allow tenants in multifamily buildings to get services themselves if their housing provider is delinquent, and potentially negotiate an agreement to submeter the building, or to just divide up the water bill and to pay it as individuals. It's a big omnibus bill. I didn't cover all of it, but as you can see, there's a lot coming down the pike on utilities.
Yeah, and the submetering has been an ongoing conversation, especially with water. I mean, as most properties, especially the older ones, don't have that infrastructure to separate, and so it's a big conversation that continues to be had, not just with the common area usage, but as a whole. So we're anxiously awaiting to see how that comes through and progresses. Let's talk rent control. There's a couple of good bills here that I think we should be able to talk about, and then a couple that might be a little more sticky. And one is just a set for hearing, but I don't know how far that's going to get in so far. But the rent stabilization exemption clarification.
Sure. So this bill actually has a hearing tomorrow. And essentially the bill will maintain what was an existing exemption from rent control for properties that receive a low-income housing tax credit. Their exemption was thrown into question recently by a recent opinion by the Superior Court. And so the council is trying to play catch up and make sure that that existing exemption for low-income tax credit properties stays in place.
Yep. The residential building permit classification, I think, is relatively straightforward, especially in the conversations about commercial properties and the benefit or the sought after expectation that they could be converted to residential. As far as I know, this is just to be able to expedite that change from the tax classification. But is there anything else behind this one?
No, that's really it. I mean, what's coming here is, there's been a big push for office to residential conversions downtown that's driving a lot of the mayor's policy agenda to revive our downtown economy. And this is a part of that package of legislation to make that possible.
All right. Now, the next one, I know that there may be a handful of questions that are prompted from it, but the Rent Stabilization Protection Amendment Act of 2025, that's a Fruman bill. And this is the one that would limit the amount that the housing authority pays for vouchers, or at least sets limits by to kind of streamline and line up with rent control allowances. Where else is this going to be impacted, and where is this in its progressions?
Sure. So this bill had its second hearing. It's been around now for a couple of years and had its second hearing earlier this month. So, and our public policy committee has had a lot of robust discussions around it. And so, we're looking to see this bill has not moved forward in the past, but with the changing politics in the city, it's not clear yet whether it's going to move forward this time. There is a lot of push behind it, but it will absolutely impact the bottom line of folks who are housing folks with vouchers by reducing that voucher payment amount to what they would otherwise get under rent control. And it could potentially also impact the ability of voucher holders to rent anywhere in the city. Now, obviously, there's arguments on both sides of this that we've had a robust discussion on, but it will be impactful if it does move to markup.
And there's been challenges just in terms of the rent reasonableness that was implemented a couple of years back, just to determine what they may be able to provide for those that are receiving the vouchers. So I know this is going to be one we're going to be watching very closely as it evolves through the legislative practices. Now, this next one is newer. I know we talked about it the other day, but I'm sure that unless people caught some recent press, they might not even know about this being proposed.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, even when I was at the Wilson building this morning, senior policy staff in the building had not yet heard about this. So this is a new ballot initiative that has been filed at the Board of Elections. So it's not moving through the council, it's moving through the ballot. There's a public hearing on it at the Board of Elections scheduled for December 3rd. And this one is a big deal. The top thing that it'll do, it's really a 6-page omnibus housing bill. But the top thing it would do is immediately freeze rent increases for 2 years and then implement mandatory year-long rent freezes any year where there's high inflation. And so with housing providers having to try to deal with high inflation, they wouldn't be able to raise their rents to reflect their increases in cost. In addition, and I'm not going to be able to go through everything because this ballot initiative is huge, but it would also reform our laws around sale of public land, IZ, the Housing Production Trust Fund, increase affordability mandates, and the impact of all of these new mandates would make it really hard to finance new housing production in the district through large reforms to almost every aspect of our housing ecosystem. So if that gets on the ballot, make sure that you read up on it before
Yeah.
next year.
And I did read some discrepancies in terms of what the average income is in the DC
Yeah.
region as a whole versus what they probably were forecasting. So there is some validity to some of what their ask may be, especially with it coming to the regional AMI. So definitely worth keeping on the radar. Now, eviction relief. The first two passed, and we already touched on the rental assistance reform, which is going to be able to reduce the number of stays the tenants can get after applying. And then it also talks about the court discretion. And so we'll be able to expand upon those next webinar with Brian, who's going to be dealing with those things real time, real life. But this one, I've been involved in the legislation when it was revised, I think back in 2018, about how evictions are being handled, and everybody knows about the too cold or rainy, but now they want to say if it's too hot, they can't be done either. What's the likelihood that this may get some traction?
Yeah, we the DC Association of Realtors sent a letter opposing this, and there's a hearing tomorrow on this bill, and we're going to be there for it. And so, what it would do is it'd ban evictions on days when the forecasted temperature is over 95 degrees. Looking at forecasts from last year, if you combine that with the days when it's cold and days when it's raining, it would effectively result in us banning evictions on about 137 days a year. Makes it really hard to enforce your leases. We're going to make that point with the council about how these things pile up, even if each individual piece of it seems like a compassionate response. And so, I know that there has been opposition in the Housing Committee to moving this forward in the past. And so we're going to see how serious they are at the hearing tomorrow.
All right. And this last one, the Integrity Amendment Act of 2025, I would have to say that any of our clients, if they had one infraction with the District of Columbia, we're going to be doing everything in our power not to make sure that there are two. But I know that there's other ends of the spectrum and certainly articles that are written about some housing providers. But the potential for them to revoke licenses that has that capacity is a big one, especially with the way that the eviction processes have been playing out and people getting kicked out if they don't have valid licenses. Is there anything else with this one that everybody on the call should be mindful of? Though I see it is referencing mostly for buildings that are 10 units or larger.
Yeah, so this one is targeted at large buildings, and it did have a hearing last month, and it's responding to a lot of the press that we've seen about some housing providers not maintaining their buildings. I think if this is going to move forward based on the hearing I was at, they're likely going to make some significant changes here because some of these numbers about the number of infractions probably don't make a ton of sense. But in addition to going after business licenses, if you have a lot of housing code infractions, this also proposes to substantially expand proactive inspections for properties that have those infractions as well. And so, there could definitely be, if they don't make some modifications here, some unintended impacts on good housing providers trying to make it.
Yeah, and it's important to stay one step ahead of the curve. That's why we do proactive inspections just to make sure that things are getting done. Tenants don't report everything, and we all know ignorance is not bliss when it comes to managing these properties. And so being able to get eyes on it, getting that proactive maintenance schedule, being able to caulk the tub before it leaks into a unit below. I mean, these are things that most people recognize as a step in the right direction. So it's critical to stay one step ahead. And this, even though it may not be implemented upon the independent housing providers, it's a good practice to follow. And we do. So fantastic. I know that there's a lot more coming down, and there's ultimately we could probably have these every handful of months with new expectations. But ultimately we're staying on top of this regulatory change so that you don't have to. This active policy leadership. I've been serving on the DCAR Public Policy Committee, the NARPM DC chapter for more than a decade. It's through the professional property managers in the room that we're going to be able to give this real impact because a lot of this legislation is going to be landlord tenant driven. We're monitoring these things early. We're getting effective and in front of them, and we're tracking everything that's real estate and housing related. So we can focus on the proposals that the landlord tenant operations, the leasing, the compliance, the long-term relationships that we have. There's always going to be strategic collaboration, not only between our team and those that are influencing the legislation, but there are other players in the game, and it's always best to speak with the same voice. So we do have a lot of strategies and shared conversations with other housing providers. We want to focus on the communication and the summaries for our talking points for our clients, our team members, because these things do come with reasonable thought and rationale. So we want to make sure that we're sharing it and advocating and educating and taking on that really trusted advisory role, not only within the association, but as the city as a whole, because in the end, we want to keep it balanced. We want it to be community-minded approach, and we're here to advocate for fair and practical housing policies that support responsible owners, protect the tenants, and ensure a healthy, sustainable rental ecosystem in the district, because a lot of the inventory, a lot of the housing stock is provided by the small housing providers. And so that's what we're here for, to be able to give guidance. So with that said, and I know that was a sprint, we covered a lot in a short period of time. I am opening it up to questions for anybody that does have it. I really appreciate all that Sean has done this past year. He has taken what his predecessors have done and amplified it. It was a busy year, and I know that there's so much more to come. So his insight and experience has been invaluable. For those that are on, I am offering up a free rental market position so I can do an analysis. And we're also giving out a couple months free management fees for anybody that signs up within the next couple of weeks. But with that said, I will share my meeting link. But at the same time, Elise, are there any questions that we can help field before we jump off this call?
Yes, there's a couple questions. The first one is, please provide instructions about accessing today's webinar and previous ones. Is access via video or transcript? Your webinar is excellent.
Well, thank you very much. Sean did all the heavy lifting and has all the experience, but no, we will be sharing it out to all those that registered. And there's also a owner resource center on our webpage so that you'll be able to see this and pass videos. So thank you for asking that. As far as the transcript, I think Elise we do, but you'd know better than I.
Yeah, there's no transcript, but I'll be sharing the link. Will you cover the process that landlords must follow to comply with BBL in the RAD replacement document?
Yeah. I don't know if we're going to be having time to talk about that next, but I think it's worth talking about the verification of the rent registry, especially since that deadline is impending by month's end. We will probably expand upon that next month. But I did have a webinar previously about those, and you might be able to get a little bit about walking through the licensing process. But I'm also happy to talk to you because that is a service we're able to offer in-house now for our clients. And so it's if you're having trouble navigating it, I would highly recommend that you become legal sooner than later, and we can talk what those steps look like.
All right, we got a few more questions in here. There was an exemption for buildings with fewer than less than 4 units, but does that also apply to landlords who own fewer than 4 units in separate, larger buildings?
If you own, so multiple units, different addresses. As far as my understanding of the law is, scattered site would be the same as if they were all on the same lot and square.
All right, moving on. If low-income housing is already established, exempt from the current rent control laws, how are they proposed to be included in the newly proposed Rent Control Act?
Good question. And I don't know the answer to that one. I think it's worth seeing where the legislation goes. But Sean, do you have any insight to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about a couple of bills here that this may be talking about. Properties that have a low income housing tax credit were previously exempt from rent control, and the council is trying to have them be exempt from rent control going forward. For Fruman's bill, which may be what this is referring to, it basically there's a conflict here. So whether you're going to get the amount that your voucher amount, which is can be higher than the amount you could get under rent control, or you're going to get the amount that you would otherwise rent to another tenant. And that's really the question. Previously, if you had a rent controlled building, you might get higher than the rent control amount because we were paying the voucher rent reasonable amount across all buildings, whether they were rent stabilized or not. And so this would lower your payments if you did have a rent stabilized building and had a voucher holder in it. So hopefully that answers the question.
All right, next question. I wonder about the rental registry and the city's requirement to require housing providers to perform data entry service for RAD forms, data that already received. I find this to be a very odd request passed by the council.
About the rent registry city's requirements requiring housing providers. Yeah, so I think that the information that has been provided over the last decades, at least the last 15 years, has been logged, but I don't know that any of it became digitized, and that's essentially the backbone to that additional expectation, from my understanding. And it would be easier for everybody to go through and do it independently than for them to sort through the backlog. I could be wrong in that, but that's just my impression.
Next question. Great webinar. What is your advice for landlords owning 1 or 2 condos? Sell and run away?
No, I think that the city's going to be resilient. I think that things are going to come around. I've talked to plenty of investors that are bullish in the market, and it is beneficial for you looking long term, not short term on the current conditions. So as long as you're able to secure tenants and look at what those year end and future goals are going to be for yourself, I'm happy to dissect what your specifics are and be able to make sure that it does in fact make sense. I do know that there's lots of properties that are on the market and not as much is going under contract. So retention's been a big word in our vocabulary of late, trying to keep good quality tenants and weathering the storm, if per se.
All right, well, that's all the questions I see on my end. Thank you guys for your great questions.
Thank you very much. And thank you again, Sean, for your time. I appreciate it. And I look forward to keeping everybody updated as I anticipate even more to come.
Thank you, Conrad.
Thank you.